Okay, good morning everybody. I just echo Lynn's welcome to Newcastle, and also to say thanks to Lynn and her team for setting up this event. We had the idea it would be a good thing to do, but of course Lynn is somebody who, it's never a problem to actually do it, so thanks for setting it up. Okay, can I have my slides, or am I in charge? I'm in charge, okay. So they've asked me to talk about a Newcastle perspective. I think this is, they put me on first to get me out of the way, basically. And I'm going to talk a bit about things past, what we've done in the past around Lewy Body Dementia, a bit about what's happening now, and a little bit about the future, although others are going to elaborate on some of that. So here's Newcastle, probably in the 1980s, I think the picture on the left, when the nightclub boat was there, you remember that? And now up to date. And that sort of spans the period, the sort of 80s until now, when we've been doing Lewy Body Dementia research in Newcastle. And when we started, I got quite a ribbing from my colleagues around the country, and indeed around the world, because they felt really that dementia with Lewy bodies was something that only happened in Newcastle. It was a sort of local phenomenon. Maybe it was caused by heavy industry and engineering oil and some kind of strange exposure. Maybe it was just a fantasy of ours, or maybe it was down to brown ale. And actually, if you look at the brown ale bottle, it's got things that look a bit like Lewy bodies on it. So when we started out on this enterprise, it was really something that people were very sceptical about, didn't really quite believe. And the reason was this, that what some of you will know, but many people won't know, is that as recently as the 1970s and 80s, which isn't that long ago, it's still within most of our memories, it was believed that dementia in older people was due to brain aging. And it was really only studies in Newcastle by Sir Bernard Tomlinson and colleagues that established that no, that wasn't actually correct. When people started to look at the brains of elderly people who died with dementia, they found that half of them had the changes of Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease had been thought to be a rare dementia affecting younger people. So this was a big Newcastle perspective on dementia generally. And when I was taught old age psychiatry initially, this is what I was brought up to believe, that if somebody had dementia, they probably had Alzheimer's disease. If they didn't, they would have probably had vascular dementia or a mixture of those two things. And that was how we diagnosed all our patients. But we continued to look at elderly people with dementia coming to autopsy. And Professor Robert Perry, who's in the audience, where are you, Robert? Okay, that's the fellow over there. So he and other colleagues looked again at the brains of patients and discovered that the map of causes wasn't actually quite as straightforward. And you'll see in grey at the bottom that about 20% of elderly people with dementia, in fact, had a pathology that wasn't Alzheimer's disease, it wasn't vascular disease, it was something else, and that something else was what we now call dementia with Lewy bodies. So I'll just try and explain a little bit about that to you, what it means, and try and make some sense of it. So a common question that we get when we particularly have carer groups is, what is a Lewy body? What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything to me. What's a Lewy body? Well, a Lewy body is essentially a microscopic clump of a protein called alpha-synuclein. You can see the alpha-synuclein molecule up at the top there, this molecule here, which you see is folded in a very elaborate way. And like a lot of these proteins that are in the brain, it has a tendency to misfold itself, get sticky and clump together with other alpha-synuclein molecules. So this is just a general tendency of these complicated brain proteins. And as this happens, these proteins, the alpha-synuclein molecules, form themselves into sort of small groupings, perhaps a small number of molecules stuck together, which are toxic. We call these oligomers or protofibrils. There are lots of names for the different constellations these molecules can accumulate into. But essentially, there's a type of alpha-synuclein, which is toxic to the brain. It damages nerve cells, it damages the processes of nerve cells, and the nerve cells have to get rid of it. And they have a machinery that does that, basically. The abnormal, the toxic alpha-synuclein gets labelled by a chaperone that says, you know, for the waste bin, has to be got rid of, and the cell can process it and turn it into non-toxic synuclein, which then can be disposed of. But sometimes this machinery goes wrong. There are a variety of reasons. It could be a genetic mutation. It could be there's too much of this stuff being produced. It may be other reasons, age-related, that these enzyme systems that break the bad synuclein down, that it starts not working properly. And Josie Brass may talk to you about some of the genetic causes for this. So when that happens, this abnormal toxic stuff, the cell copes with it by putting it into these Lewy bodies. They're sort of dustbins full of, you know, it's a safe haven, it's a safe place to put these things out of the way. It doesn't really resolve the problem. You're not getting rid of it, you're just storing it up. And of course, if you do that for long enough, these things in themselves probably lead to cell death. So it's a kind of short-term solution. So here's a Lewy body, and here's a Lewy body in the brain. You can only see these things under the microscope after the person's died. But you can see here the stained with traditional stains, as we did it in the 1970s. What Robert and his colleagues was able to do, this isn't somebody with Parkinson's disease, this is sort of classic Lewy body. What Robert and his colleagues were able to do was to look in other parts of the brain where these things were much harder to see using these methods. And that's how they had identified dementia with Lewy bodies. In the modern day, we're able to see not just Lewy bodies, but even these are what we call Lewy neurites. These are the sort of smaller aggregations of synuclein, because we can use monoclonal antibodies for synuclein itself. So over a period of about 20 years, there's been a shift in how we've looked, where we've looked in the brain, in order to understand Lewy body disease. I put this slide in especially to inflame Professor Adams, because it shows a staging system of Lewy body pathology. We're in the process of revising and refreshing this, and this is a system published by a group in Arizona, in the brain bank there. We don't quite agree with this, but it's a nice picture. That's why I've put it there. And what it illustrates is that Lewy body disease can occur in different parts of the brain. And we've known for a long time that it probably starts in the olfactory bulb in this part of the brain, and it spreads up into the midbrain, brainstem regions, where it's associated with Parkinson's disease. And that's really when it was first described. That was the Lewy body I showed you, the simple one to see. Dementia with Lewy bodies is associated with Lewy bodies in this area, the limbic cortex, and eventually the neocortex, the green bit. So it's in a different part of the brain. So that's why we have these different disorders that are caused by the same underlying disease. Parkinson's disease is caused by Lewy bodies and neuron loss in this area and down here, and dementia with Lewy bodies is caused by disease in this part of the brain. And of course, it's not as simple as that. It can spread in many kind of directions and give you many kind of different constellations of symptoms. So, sorry, this is a makeup. Whoops. Okay. So, the patients that we see fall into sort of one or two clear groups. There are the people who start out with Parkinson's disease. So they're the people with brainstem disease who have tremor and rigidity and difficulty walking and balancing. They're one group. And then another group over here who start out with cognitive impairment, because they've got the disease predominantly in the green cerebral cortex areas. And these people are very often thought initially to have had Alzheimer's disease. They get clinically misdiagnosed often as having Alzheimer's in the early cases. But there are lots of other symptoms that are associated. This strange thing, REM sleep behaviour disorder, a disorder of sleep where people have dreaming sleep but don't get the normal paralysis, muscle paralysis that goes on in dreaming sleep. So they kick and thrash around in the bed and shout out, and that often goes on for 10 or 15 years before other symptoms. Patients have these, people with Lewy body disease have this sort of fluctuating, delirious kind of syndrome, often with visual hallucinations, very prominent. It's a thing that often makes people think of the diagnosis for the first time because the person affected is starting to talk about people coming into the house, people being in the house, very realistic, vivid visual hallucinations that can't be explained otherwise. So Lewy Body Dementia has a lot of different presentations depending on really where the disease starts in the brain. And we also know now that these abnormal synuclein proteins, once one of them gets abnormally folded up, if it gets in contact with another synuclein molecule, it tends to make it go the same way. It kind of converts it, and so this thing starts to spread. And it goes from one nerve cell to another, so it spreads throughout the brain in a kind of progressive way. So you can understand that for some people, if it gets into one part of the brain and it spreads through that part of the brain, it's going to be Parkinson's disease. For somebody else, if it gets in a different part of the brain and spreads through that bit, it's going to be dementia. But why that happens, we really still do not understand at all. It remains, I think, a mystery. Everybody will know this story, the 6 blind men and the elephant. It was 6 men of Hindustan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. So they all went and sort of felt and saw, what's this thing in front of them. So the chap who felt the tail thought it was a stick, and the fellow who was on the side of the elephant thought it was a wall, and the chap who was at the front feeling the trunk, he thought it might be a snake. And this is what we've dealt with Lewy body disease for a long time, actually, that because it's got all of these different presentations and ways it can appear, we've tended, people like me, to just look at one bit. So the Parkinson's doctors were busy looking at the movement disorder bit, and people like me were looking at the cognitive impairment dementia bit, and nobody really got the overview. So here are sort of 2 of the people who've been very instrumental in trying to get the overview. Dr. Lewy on the left, who described the Lewy bodies in Parkinson's disease over 100 years ago, and Kenny Kosaka, who's a colleague of ours who works in Yokohama, who in the 1970s really was the visionary who started to see the whole elephant. He was one of the first people to see these Lewy bodies in the brains of people with dementia and recognised that it was happening in the other types of disorder as well, and started to try and put the whole thing together. He wasn't the only one. There were about 5 groups in the world who were interested in this. One of them was in Newcastle, working here. I'll not bore you with all of the detail of it. But part of the Newcastle perspective on things was to try and integrate all of this, to try and bring things together. And that's what we've done, essentially. So this was the first meeting that we ever held. It was in 1993 we held it in the Vermont Hotel, which you'll know. It used to be Northumberland County Hall, I think, in its heyday. So out of this, we got all of the world's experts who are interested into Newcastle. We got them to resolve and agree their differences. We came up with this term, dementia with Lewy bodies. We said this is how the brain should be examined, and this is where we should look and report the Lewy bodies. And we also described the clinical symptoms so that people could start diagnosing it. We did the same thing again. Now at the Civic Centre, we've been sort of upgraded a bit to the Civic Centre. And this was back in 2003. And we wrote a paper in 2005, which has been used for the last decade around the world for clinically diagnosing and pathologically reporting dementia with Lewy bodies. So this has been very influential and important thing. Some of you will have seen these diagnostic criteria. This is the description of the dementia with Lewy body disorder. We're in the process now of revising these. We had a big meeting, a global meeting, not in Newcastle this time. We went to Fort Lauderdale in Miami, which in December, I'll tell you, is a much better place to be. And we're in the business of just revising and updating these things. So we still retain a leading interest in dementia with Lewy bodies and trying to guide it and have a perspective on what's important. The Lewy Body Society has been particularly helpful to us. The society started at around the same time, 10 years ago, that we were writing and publishing this recent set of criteria. So the history that we've had with the Lewy Body Society has been kind of over that period. And you're going to hear presentations next from two researchers who are supported by the Lewy Body Society who'll tell you some really up-to-date work. So just to summarise a bit, what have we achieved? Well, just very quickly, I've already suggested to you that we've been interested in looking at which areas of the brain are affected and why, and how does that lead to symptoms. Together with John O'Brien and other colleagues in Newcastle, we did a large trial which has established a brain imaging method. It's something called DAT scan, dopamine transporter scan, which is a diagnostic method for distinguishing dementia with Lewy bodies from Alzheimer's disease. Often not easy to do just on clinical grounds. So we developed that first test, and that's now licensed throughout Europe. We did the first clinical trial here of Exelon, it was in fact, but an Alzheimer's drug that actually works better in dementia with Lewy bodies, and that remains the standard of care. This rather dull-looking book is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, published in the USA, which is actually the sort of Bible for reimbursement of any conditions. So if you're in this, you exist in terms of people will refund and pay for your health and social care in the US. And in 2013, dementia with Lewy bodies found its way into this, enormously important. Now drug companies, for instance, think this is a target for treatment trials because it's been legitimised within DSM-5. So as John O'Brien will tell you, we now have drug trials in DLB for the first time ever, really. People are using novel drugs to see if we can treat patients. And again, I think John might talk to you a little bit about just trying to improve the management of patients within the NHS across the board. And then finally, how have we sustained ourselves to do all this work? Well, for the last 5 years, the National Institute for Health Research, which is the research bit of the NHS, have supported what they've called a biomedical research unit. So there are a number of these centres of excellence across the country, and we've had the only, as far as I know, it's the only Lewy Body Dementia dedicated research unit in the world, but certainly it's the only one in this country. And they've supported our clinical and basic research into Lewy body disease. I'll not talk in any detail about studies, but they have, over the last few years, supported an interest, which is we want to try and identify this disease early, because treatments probably are only going to really be helpful if we can introduce them before people have got, worse, if you know what I mean by that. We want to diagnose and treat early. So the Lewy Pro study has been going very successfully, so we expect to report on that. And then a sort of interest of mine is that although we're quite good at recognising typical dementia with Lewy bodies, that's the fluctuating Parkinsonian hallucinating patient, what we aren't so good at is recognising the people who don't present in such a typical way. And that's perhaps, as you can see by the size of the boxes I've drawn, we're good at the tip of the iceberg, but for every one patient we diagnose correctly, there may be at least one, if not two, or even more, who we don't diagnose. And that's because these people don't look clinically typical. At the moment, they get called Alzheimer's disease, and they get, therefore, inappropriate management. And so that's something that interests me. How can we identify those people? So we wrote recently an application to renew our biomedical research centre. You can imagine that funding is very tight at the moment and not going to improve probably. So we were delighted a few weeks ago to be told that we've got further 5 years funding we're now a biomedical research centre rather than a unit, but that's a political thing. It doesn't affect how we behave. And within that, Lewy body dementia is a major theme. I'm confident that we'll get good support from that. So I think the future looks rosy for us. The challenges are hard. It's a difficult disease, but we've attracted some very good collaborations. And of course, we get tremendous support, not just from the Lewy Body Society, but from the local community. People like yourselves who express interest, who support us through the brain banking, through our PPI programmes. So thanks for that. We'll keep trying, and I hope that you find the rest of today interesting. Thank you.